A challenge faced by organisations today is how do you prioritise? How do you make sure you're focused on the right thing that's going to deliver the maximum benefit for your organisation and for your customer? Today I'm going to talk about adaptive portfolio management, a repeatable data-driven process that can be applied whether you're on a digital transformation journey or not. My name is Chris Buxton and this is one of my digital insights. I talk to many people in different organisations and prioritisation comes up time and time again as a key issue. Whether you're an executive trying to prioritise the right investments for your organisation, or whether you're a staff member trying to navigate the amount of work and competing priorities to keep the customer satisfied and engaged, prioritisation is key. I think what's happening at the moment though, and a big challenge for organisations, is the nature of work is changing. The pace of change is accelerating and the expectation of customers is increasing. In traditional project portfolio management, I think we could take a longer term activity to prioritise and work out what our investments, because they were largely capital intensive and they required that major funding activity. But as we're moving into the adoption of cloud-based services and other delivery mechanisms, we can now make quite significant changes quite rapidly in the environment and take advantage of digitally enabled opportunities to really engage and satisfy the customer in different and innovative ways. And I think because of that, we're now trying to balance out those large investment activities with a lot of smaller work in our organisation. But our planning is built around the large investments. It's built around the year-on-year investments and what the organisation is going to be spending its money on each year. Now, because it was once a year activity, it was able to be very subject matter and leadership led. It was a people intensive activity. So to understand the different attributes of investments and prioritise them, we were able to get all of the relevant stakeholders together in a room and spend a lot of time talking over the relative merits of individual pieces of work to work out what is the most important. But as we're moving into a far more adaptable environment, we're not able to do that anymore because everybody would spend most of their time in meetings talking about the relative merits of change opportunities and wouldn't actually get any work done. So the nature of prioritisation has to change. So what I'm going to talk about today is a mechanism that will enable organisations to take advantage of incremental change, but also incorporate new opportunities and new ways of working into their organisation, using data to enable them to prioritise and decide what is the most important thing for them as an organisation, so that they can make sure they're working on the right things to deliver the best outcome. Okay, so how do we get started? The first stage really is to provide transparency over all of the work that's going on in your organisation, which on the face of it sounds a little daunting, but the reality is this is something that evolves over time. If we go in with an expectation that we're going to get every piece of work and every opportunity recorded in the first iteration, I think we are doomed for failure. We're setting ourselves up to fail. The expectation has to be that this is something that we get better at each time we execute. And as we execute, we gather more information about the opportunities that are available within our organisation. And through that, we start to grow and mature the prioritisation process. So as I say, the first element is to create transparency over the portfolio of work we have going on in our organisation. Now, at this point, the expectation is that it's all going to be following different life cycles. We do have different types of work going on in our organisation, and we can't have an expectation that everybody is suddenly going to be starting to produce project proposals and other documentation for what are small scale innovation activities in our organisation. So we have to go in with an expectation that there are different levels of information and then different levels of accountability that are related to these different types of work. But through creating transparency, we also start to identify what are the common attributes of a piece of work that we can start to use to enable us to get an aggregated understanding of what's happening in our organisation. a key element of all of this is trying to have a common definition around value and benefit so that we can start to compare pieces of work. The danger is that invariably, if you're looking for a benefit of a piece of work, a major project or investment will invariably have identified a bigger benefit than a small process improvement activity. And because of that, if we just think about benefits, then immediately we will default to the biggest pieces of work. And ultimately, that's what's been happening in organizations for years, really undermining some of that small scale improvement that could be happening in organizations. So we have to think differently. It is about balancing cost and benefit so that we get the maximum value from our piece of work. Now, we've got different types of work that move at different paces. So we're going to have projects and programs that might still be following a year-on-year life cycle. I think sometimes when we try and force a project into following an agile life cycle, it creates tension for us and it creates problems that undermines our confidence in the ability to deliver those pieces of work. So it's okay to have waterfall projects in this environment. It's okay to have a 12-month investment or a 2-year investment that will take that long to deliver. We shouldn't be worried about that, and we shouldn't be trying to force it into a 90-day or agile incremented delivery model if it's not suitable for that piece of work or if we're just not very good at it. But the other piece we've got is keeping the lights on activity. So security patching of operating systems and software, maintenance, fixing bugs, operational processes and activities that we need to carry out on a daily basis to keep our organization running. Now, these traditionally don't get recorded in the same way. I think quite often they're not recorded at all anywhere, but they're quite important because they take time. But also they're important because they're quite often, when the priority of projects and programs take precedent, these are the first things that get dropped off. And that results in a lowering of your security posture, a reduction in resilience, and ultimately problems for your organization. The other element that we're starting to see grow, though, is around innovation and a growing need for organizations to innovate to deliver customer satisfaction. Being able to take these different types of work where by its very nature, we're not quite sure what the life cycle of these might look like, but they need to be prioritized in the same way. And then, of course, we've got small scale process improvement that naturally occurs in every organization, but struggles to get the resource and the time because it's never escalated to the point where an organization can get visibility so it can focus on them. So being able to record all of these pieces of work in a transparent way will enable us to get a good insight into what are the opportunities for our organization so we can make some real choices about what we want to work on. Now, as I say, there must be some common element on here so they can come together in an aggregated view of all of these pieces of work. They go into our pipeline then so that we can start to prioritize and plan out our execution for the coming phases. But because of the different types of work, they're following different timelines as well. So a project might be running over a 12-month period. A keeping the lights on activity might be a repeatable activity that we do once a month that takes 2 hours. An innovation might be a 5-day activity, or a process improvement might be anything from 1 day up to 2 weeks. But each of them need to be prioritized so they can be mapped out over implementation. And that's why I think we have to move more to an incremental delivery model. Because if you're trying to plan out at the start of the year your small scale process improvement for 11 months away, it's just not feasible. You're not going to have that level of insight necessary to plan that far ahead, which means it's never going to get the attention it deserves. So that's why I say it's important that we start to think about incremental delivery and planning delivery of all of these different pieces of work in a small scale way that we can then aggregate up for the bigger picture. So as it goes into prioritization, we start to think about prioritization differently as well. So because of the different types of work, trying to follow an old school model of getting everybody in a room and to discuss the relative merits is just not feasible because there's too many pieces of work for that to be occurring. Because if you were to look at even a simple Dragon's Den type process, each piece of work may be taking 10 to 15 minutes to discuss what it's trying to do and the merits or not of that piece of work. Now, if you've got half a dozen pieces of work, that might be achievable. If you've got 30 or 40, that becomes less so. And if you're looking at quite a large organization that could be looking at 200 to 300 process improvement opportunities or keeping the lights on activities, it's just not feasible to do. It would take you longer in the planning activity than it would to actually deliver the piece of work. So we have to start thinking about using data to enable us to prioritize. Now, one of the mechanisms that we can use for that is the strategic cascade. This is an existing model that we can use to enable us to link data to our strategic outcome so that we can associate with our piece of work and determine its relative merits against that strategic cascade. The idea is that you need layers of planning before you can get down to the level of detail necessary to enable you to make choices in your day-to-day work. Strategic goals by their very nature are quite high level and abstract. So trying to use those as decision-making tools is quite difficult. Even below there, where we're talking about focus areas and other initiatives, trying to understand how an individual activity might relate to those, it can be quite difficult. So the idea is that we cascade down layers to increase understanding and detail that allow us to connect our piece of work back to a strategic goal. And that connection creates transparency for everybody. People associated with that piece of work can understand more about how that piece of work relates to a strategic goal. But also the organization gets a lot more clarity and transparency how each piece of work contributes to the strategic outcomes for the organization. So what does a strategic cascade look like? Ultimately, at the top, you start with a strategic goal. And in the example here, a common goal would be around the reduction of corporate overheads. There's a very high level goal statement that we're looking for in an organization. And by its very nature, as I say, it's very difficult to determine how a piece of work would contribute to that. I think often when we do direct linking to strategic goals, you see initiatives around implementation of systems rather than the delivery of individual outcomes. And then the focus of that piece of work becomes a technology focus rather than a business improvement outcome. And we want to avoid that. We need to focus on the key outcomes we are trying to achieve, not the fact that we're introducing a new system or widget or piece of technology. So as we distill that down, we start to identify focus areas that will allow us to achieve that goal. And in the example here, we're talking about the automation and digitization of employee agreement processes. It's something that HR departments spend a lot of time on, signing contracts, offboarding, onboarding, and all those other agreements that are established with an employee as they go through their employment life cycle. So being able to automate and digitize that would take quite a large element of cost and overhead out of an organization. So as a focus area, that sounds plausible. But again, we have to really understand what we're trying to achieve within that goal, because it would be very easy there to say, okay, we're going to automate and digitize, so we need a new system, so we'll just implement a system. But it might be you've already got systems that would enable this. So what we're going to start to focus on is the values that we're seeking to deliver through that strategic focus area. And this is slightly different then, because it's these value statements that we will then use to help us prioritize, because it's about maximizing the value of a piece of work, not whether it's linked to a strategy. If we simply link to a strategy, the danger is that every piece of work defaults up to quite a large project because you get the biggest bang for your buck, the biggest strategic alignment at that point. But by going on the value statements, we can start to incrementally deliver value, ultimately aggregating up to deliver that strategic goal for the organization. The examples here are values that could be used in the prioritization of a piece of work. They could also be values as part of the design activity for solutions. So if you are going to go down a technology driven route and implement a system, some of the process or the value statements here could be used as architectural design values to inform the design of a solution. And then below there, we start to incorporate data. We start to incorporate our key performance indicators against those values so that we can measure the impact of pieces of work. So it's not just about do we prioritize and then approve and away you go. We set up a cycle so that as we're prioritizing, we're understanding the value statements that are going to be delivered and enhanced through this piece of work, and what is the value that work is going to deliver to the organization. That is mapped against key performance indicators, so we can then monitor those performance indicators to give us an insight into whether that piece of work delivered the outcome we were expecting. If the answer is yes, that can then be fed back into the value statements. But if the answer is no, we have to look at, were the value statements right? Was the piece of work right? And adjust our thinking and mature our thinking at this point so we continue to get improving outcomes for the organization. So really coming out of that prioritization stream is a coherent list that has all of your pieces of work in a relative priority order. It will enable you to make them some no calls, so you will be able to look at what are the things that we definitely know we're not going to do this year. But the approach is not to slavishly create an execution list of items. So coming out of the prioritization, it's not going to be a list of things where you do number one first, number two second, number three third. Because the next component of the process is to understand your resource availability, understand your skills and capabilities that you have as an organization, and what is their availability to execute pieces of work. Because as I say, it's about maximizing the return for your organization. And if you slavishly follow a priority script, what you will find is that people are going to be applied to probably the non-optimized piece of work for them as an individual. They're probably not going to have the right skills balance for what you're trying to achieve as an organization. And you're going to end up pulling people in lots of different directions all at the same time as they try and navigate all of the different priorities in your organization. So understanding the resource and the people capabilities you have available will allow you to roadmap more and get clarity over the right sequence of events that will maximize delivery for your organization. I think sometimes people look at the people capability element and just go, well, it's our number one priority. If we haven't got the resource available, we will just go and get a contractor or a consultant. Well, this creates further problems down the line, because where is your strategic thinking coming from? Where is your intellectual property that is going to help you optimize that solution in the future and continue to deliver? My experience is you don't optimize a process and you don't optimize a system until it's actually being used in anger, until it's been deployed to operations, because that's when people learn the nuance of it. It gets interacted with different people in different ways, and we tweak those processes then to make sure they're working for our staff. Now, if you've just employed contractors and consultants, when you come to that optimization phase, they've all left. So all the knowledge of the process, understanding of the system, and understanding what you've done has just left your organization. So my recommendation is focus on your internal people first. They're the ones that should be driving your strategic objectives. And once you've got that, if you need additional technical support to augment that strategic thinking, that's when you go to consultants and contractors. You don't use consultants and contractors to do your strategic thinking for you. So that's an important facet. So when it comes to the resource availability, though, I think one of the dangers here is staff see this as micromanagement. Staff might see this as an attempt to reduce headcount or manage them or do something else that perhaps isn't in their best interest. So when I talk about a resource management plan, I'm thinking more about the types of skills that people might have. So it might be project management, it might be a software developer or a particular type of software developer, it might be a business analyst, but breaking it down by capability rather than individuals. And understanding then you can map individuals to those capabilities. But when you're thinking about planning, it's very much at that capability level. And as I say, this is to avoid any sort of interpretation of this as being micromanagement, because in Agile, that is one of the things that we're hearing quite a lot now, is that staff are starting to see processes like Scrum and Kanban more as micromanagement than actually an optimized delivery process. So at this point in the process, what we've got is a list of things in a prioritized order. From that prioritization, we will have an understanding of what skills and capabilities are necessary to deliver them. That needs to be part of that definition phase. We will have a list of capabilities and our availability over the next planning period, whatever that may be. So the next stage is to bring the two together. And I think this is where leadership comes in. This is where management and subject matter expertise has to be applied. It's about optimizing delivery at this point. So understanding the relative priorities, understanding the resources and the people capability you have available, aligning the two so that you produce a roadmap for the next period. Now, this could be an annual roadmap, but I would recommend you don't do that. The whole point of adaptive portfolio management is that you can incrementally plan, and you're continually planning throughout the year. So the recommendation would be a 90-day plan. That is, it's long enough that you can deliver a meaningful piece of work, but short enough that you can develop an incremental approach to planning. So the roadmap is a 90-day roadmap. And this is an important recurring theme through here, is that it's a continual alignment between priorities and resource availabilities on a 90-day cycle, and you replan every 90 days. That gives staff clarity for at least a 3-month period, but also it's short enough that people can know that they've got another bite of the cherry in the year. They can come back later and hopefully they will get reprioritized, and they will come out of the prioritization and road mapping machine. As you go into execution though, if there's pieces of work that you didn't get around to at the end of that 90 days, it's important that they don't just roll over. Because the danger in all of this is that if there's pieces of work in any sort of recurring life cycle like this, if there's pieces of work, the danger is they just get left in, and then you augment that with a lot of other stuff as well. What that does is increase the expectation of delivery, it increases the scope of work that's being applied, and it makes it unmanageable for people. So they have to start prioritizing themselves. So if there are unfinished pieces of work, they go back into the pipeline. Now, if that piece of work is already being started and you've already got an investment going on in that space, they go back into the road mapping piece. So they go straight back into the 90 days to make sure it's included in the roadmap to be finished off. Because as I say, you've already started the investment. You don't want to throw that investment away. You want to complete and deliver. If there are pieces of work that haven't been started yet, however, they can go back into resource planning. They can go back into the alignment piece between our priorities and our people availability. Because it might be your assumption on who was going to be available to execute a piece of work was incorrect. And I think you've got to understand that, because there is a reason you didn't get around to starting it. So understanding that is quite important in this planning process, because through doing that, you incrementally get better at planning and improve your planning process. Then it's a case of repeat that cycle. If there's new pieces of work that come in, they go into the initial pipeline, they go through an assessment against the cascaded values, they're prioritized against that, and they're now fed in for resource planning. And new pieces of work throughout the year can be established and identified, but they'll go into the same pipeline as all the other pieces of work, so they can be prioritized accordingly. And then it's a case of every cycle replanning, replanning, replanning. If there's something that comes up in an emergency throughout the 90 days, that can be brought through the pipeline, applied to a roadmap, and on the understanding that something else in that roadmap won't be completed because of this emergency that has arisen. And again, if that piece of work hasn't been started or it's part way through, it's fed back into the planning cycle to be replanned for execution. And this then becomes a recurring activity that organizations can undertake. And because it's data driven, you will have confidence that everybody is following the same criteria in the same way, and should be getting a consistent and reliable outcome. If not, then you can look at those value statements and adjust them accordingly to make sure you're getting the best benefit and you're focused on the right outcome. And then you can start to measure using the KPIs and the data that you've got, see how your organization is improving and how it's delivering on the strategic objective. If you want to hear more about my approach to adaptive portfolio management, you can contact me via the link that's in the comments below. Alternately, you can subscribe to my channel and hear more of my digital insights in the coming weeks as I talk more about how organizations need to change and evolve to really take advantage of those digitally enabled opportunities. My name is Chris Buxton, and this has been one of my digital insights.